Good morning. Today in Luke, we would continue looking at some of the conversation between Jesus and the Pharisees and others, and it's some pretty familiar stuff. He was in the temple teaching. The chief priests and elders came and asked, "By whose authority are you doing all of this?" And Jesus, instead of answering, it's by the authority of God, my Father, says, well, how about John the Baptist? Where did he get his authority? Was it from man or was it from heaven? And of course, then they didn't want to give him a decent answer because, well, they'd be in trouble either way. However, they answered that way. And so then Jesus says, well, I'm not going to answer your question either. And he tells the parable about, the man planting the vineyard and going away and sending, somebody to get the rent, and finally sending his son. They kill his son. And, the people say, well, Jesus says, so they threw him out. What will the owner do? He will come and destroy those tenants. And Jesus says it in this passage from Luke. In other passages, as this story is told, Jesus asks, what do you suppose will happen? And they answer, the same thing. Well, he will come in and he will destroy them. And but they thought that shouldn't be that way. But Jesus said, well, that's the way it's going to be. And the last thing in Luke that we would look at today, or we will look at, is they watched him. It said, sent spies who pretended to be honest in order to try to trap him. And they asked about paying taxes. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Because this was a big contention. Because on the coins, Caesar's picture was there, and Caesar was the god. And and Jesus just responds with that familiar line: give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And so they don't catch him there either. Jesus is differentiating between the things of the world and the things of heaven. And he continues to do that. And he reminds us always that, the things that we see here on earth, the things that we treasure here on earth, aren't treasures in heaven. I mean, they're not looked upon in the same way in so much of everything that way. Jesus sees through their attempt to trap him that way, and turns the tables back on them. And so I'm going to go a little bit different direction right now. The Old Testament reading is from 1Kings 3 and 4, and this is when Solomon has ascended to the throne of king. David had been king. Solomon is his son by Bathsheba, that's a whole other story, an interesting story of David and Bathsheba and Uriah and all the deceit that went on within that. But yet God chose to work through David and through Bathsheba to Solomon. And Solomon, we have the Proverbs are contributed, most of them to Solomon. And we have the Song of Solomon. We have other books in our Bible from Solomon. But in chapters 3 and 4, Solomon has just become the king, and he is a young king. And there was, if you read chapters 1 and 2 of 1 Kings, there was some other people that were trying to become king. David was old, David was sickly, he wasn't able to do, and other people were trying to step up to the plate. And so, David had, promised Bathsheba that Solomon would be king after him, and Solomon was God's chosen one to be the king to succeed him. and Solomon, is building the temple. David wanted to build a temple for God, and God says, no, my temple is in the hearts of man. But when Solomon came, then it was, okay, God said to Solomon, you can build a temple. We will have a permanent place of worship. So Solomon is building the temple, but yet within the timetable of building the temple, before they had this designated place of worship, they would go up to the mountaintops. They would go to the high places and worship. And Solomon had gone to offer sacrifice and praise to God. And he had a vision, a conversation with God in this vision when he was up on that mountaintop. And God says, you found favor with me. Ask me, what it would be that you would like to have. This is in chapter 3, verses, starting at verse 6, and Solomon tells God, or God says in verse 5, ask what I should give you. Solomon says, you have shown great favor to your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in uprightness. You have kept him from this deal, and you've given him now a son, me, to sit on the throne. And he acknowledges that God has placed him on this throne. He is acknowledging God first and foremost above all things. And he says, although I'm a little child, I don't know how to go out or come in, but I'm in the midst of all these people and they expect me to know what to do. Solomon says, give me wisdom. Give me a wise and understanding mind to govern your people. Let me be able to discern between good and evil, because who can rule this great people of yours? And God is pleased with Solomon's request, rather than long life or all my enemies be destroyed or money to no end, or, what would be your wish if you had one wish, You think about that. What would be one wish that you have, that if you had an opportunity that God would grant it, or if you had the genie in the bottle, and he, had one wish. You could say, I want all my wishes filled. That would be your first wish. Have everything I wish for. But more, really? You got to be careful what you wish for in an instance like that. But Solomon asks for wisdom, for understanding. And then the next thing we read in here is an example of the understanding of the wisdom of Solomon with the story of two women who each have a newborn child. And one of the women's child dies, and she realizes it in the nighttime, and she goes and she switches babies with this other woman. They're living in the same household. And the other woman, as she wakes, discovers her baby dead, but realizes, this isn't my child. This is the child of the other woman. This isn't my child. She has pulled a switcheroo on me. And she approaches this other woman, and, she adamantly denies it, and they end up going to the king. Think about that. To take a dispute to the king, and this is a tremendous dispute. And, the woman, the real mother, is, this is my child. And the other woman, this is my child. She's telling, and how, they didn't have DNA back then, and that takes a while anyway, but Solomon, I'm sure you know the story, but Solomon in his wisdom, in his discernment that's given from God, says, bring a sword. And I'm sure they wonder, whoa, what's this deal? And he says, okay, we're going to cut this baby in half, top to bottom, and give half to each woman. And, well, that isn't going to work. We know that. They would, but the real mother says, no, let her have him. She is the mother. And Solomon understands that, this woman is the real mother, because she would give up her child to another so that her child would live. She was willing to make that sacrifice. And, Solomon had the wisdom to understand that. And I fast forward that, 14 generations or whatever, 13 from Solomon to Jesus. God was understanding enough that he was willing to sacrifice his son for you and me. And we have an example in Solomon. We have the example in Abraham. We have so many examples of this sacrifice, and of people willing to give their own flesh and blood for others. So this woman was ready to say, no, let this woman raise my son, because that way my son will live. And Solomon had that wisdom. And, to think about, a young person having wisdom like that. And Solomon was a very young man when he became king. But the people marveled. The people marveled at his wisdom, at his ability to discern, to figure out the truth of the matter, which woman was the mother. But I still, I tie that story to Jesus every time I read it, the story of these two women and the woman's readiness, her willingness to give up raising her son. I mean, just for the sake of his son or her son. And God was willing to give himself for you and for me. That's such an amazing story. And there are places in the Old Testament that I get bogged down. I'll admit that. But there are some wonderful stories in the Old Testament, and many of them we don't ever read in the Revised Common Lectionaries. We don't ever hear some of these stories on a Sunday morning. We don't even read them, not much less preach about them. And it's like, Daniel in the lion's den. I mean, we don't get that in our lectionary. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego in the fiery furnace. We hear those stories sometimes in Sunday school or Bible school, different places when we grow up. But there is so much rich history, rich examples of the love of God. And this is one of them, I think, from 1Kings chapter 3, when Solomon understands that the woman will sacrifice her ability to raise her son so that her son might live. And that's what God did for you and me, sacrificed himself so that you and I might live. So have a blessed day.